Good morning everybody. Today we are going to discuss one of the important topic about the ratio analysis, that is classification of ratios. This is the most important classification. There are different kind of classifications of ratios are there, but the most important classification is all about functional classification of ratios. Okay, functional classification of ratio. Under functional classification of ratios, there are different kind of classification. One is liquidity ratio, another is long term solvency, next one activity ratio, and last one is profitability ratio. There are four important classification of ratios. One is liquidity ratio, or it is known as to check the short term solvency position of the organization, you have to calculate liquidity ratio. So liquidity ratio क्या है? To check the short term solvency, क्या कंपनी का शॉर्ट टर्म एसेट यानी करंट एसेट सफिशिएंट है या नहीं करंट लायबिलिटी को या शॉर्ट टर्म ओब्लिगेशन को मीट अप करने के लिए, वो क्या है? वो शॉर्ट टर्म लिक्विडिटी है. वेदर द कंपनी इज हैविंग इनफ liquidity assets to pay off the liquid liability or not. Okay, so to check that one, there is a ratio you have to calculate, liquidity ratio. Okay, under the liquidity ratio there is these are the three important ratio you need to calculate. One is current ratio, then next one is liquid ratio or acid test ratio, thereafter what? Absolute liquidity ratio. Okay, or absolute liquid ratio. So these three you have to calculate under the liquidity ratio. Okay, so thereafter in order to check the long term solvency of the organization, whether the company is having enough long term solvency position, long term liquidity or not, to check that one you have to calculate the debt equity ratio. Always the owner want to do the business with the outsider capital, and the outsider want to do the business with the insider's business like the owner's capital. So that's why you have to know about the long term solvency ratios. Under long term solvency, what will come? Debt equity ratio, debt to total capital ratio, interest coverage ratio, cash flow to debt ratio, capital gearing ratio. These five things will come under the long term solvency ratio. Thereafter, activity ratio. Activity ratios, in order to check the efficiency of the organization, you need to calculate the activity ratio. In order to study the movement of the asset in the organization, in order to know whether the company is having the enough capacity to convert into the sale. For that purpose, you are calculating the activity ratio. Under the activity ratio, the inventory turnover ratio, debtors turnover ratio, payable turnover ratio, working capital turnover ratio, fixed asset turnover ratio, total asset turnover ratio, capital employed turnover ratio. So these ratios you have to calculate under the head of activity ratio, or in order to check whether the company is efficient or not, whether the operating capacity of the organization is good or bad. To check that one, you have to calculate different activity ratio. Thereafter, to check the profitability, you have to calculate different ratio. The profitability ratio can be calculated under the two heads: capital A, that is in relation to sales, and capital B in relation to investment. In relation to sales, there are different kind of ratios will be there. Gross profit ratio will be there, net profit ratio will be there, operating ratio will be there, operating profit ratio will be there, expense ratio will be there. And in relation to investment, ROI, that is return on investment, will be there, return on capital will be there, ROC, then return on equity capital, ROE, then earning per share and price earning ratio. You need to calculate to check the investment purpose. In relation to investment, you have to calculate ROI, ROC, ROE, earning per share, that is EPS, and price earning ratio. And to check in relation to sale, that is also coming under the profitability, you have to calculate the gross profit ratio, net profit ratio, operating profit ratio, and various expenses ratio. We have to go each and every ratio in detail for your clarification of entire doubts. So if you understand each and every ratio, and whatever the ratio you are there to interpret, then only there is having a better understanding about the ratio. If the calculation is very much easy, but how you are interpreting the results with a particular rule of thumb will be there, with the particular formula will be there, you have to calculate, and what is the rule of thumb will be there. Based upon that you have to interpret the result. If you are not in a position to interpret the result, then there is no meaning of calculation of any kind of ratio. So ratios could be used for the various parties who are interested for them. So that's why you have to, or you need to have what, everybody, you need to have interpret the particular result. So these are the different functional classification of what, ratios. Okay, these are the different functional classification of ratios. A student has to know this particular chart in order to have a better understanding about this ratio. If you are not having any kind of better understanding about this ratio, then interpretation become very much difficult. So that's why you need to calculate, to check the short term solvency, to check the long term solvency, to check the efficiency, and to check the profitability position of the organization. There are different kind of ratios you need to calculate. आपको different kind of ratio calculate करना पड़ेगा आपको. आपके ऑर्गेनाइजेशन का शॉर्ट टर्म सॉल्वेंसी पोजीशन क्या है, लिक्विडिटी पोजीशन अच्छा है या नहीं, इसलिए आप क्या करोगे, लिक्विडिटी रेशियो कैलकुलेट करोगे. आपका लॉन्ग टर्म सॉल्वेंसी पोजीशन अच्छा है या नहीं, आपका आउटसाइड फंड कितना है, आपका इंटरनल इक्विटी कितना है, एक्सटर्नल इक्विटी कितना है, डेट टू टोटल कैपिटल कितना है, डेट कितना है, इक्विटी कितना है, ये सब जानने के लिए आप लॉन्ग टर्म सॉल्वेंसी पोजीशन, लॉन्ग टर्म सॉल्वेंसी रेशियो कैलकुलेट करोगे टू चेक द लॉन्ग टर्म सॉल्वेंसी पोजीशन ऑफ द ऑर्गेनाइजेशन. Similarly, in order to check the efficiency of the organization, the way whether the organization is efficient or not, whether the company is converting the particular inventory to sales, how quickly, whether the debtors are converted quickly or not, whether the firm is getting more time from collection from the debtors or less time from the collection from the debtors, and how much time he is getting from his creditor. That is important. For that purpose, to check that particular efficiency of the organization, you need to calculate different kind of activity ratio, and to know the profitability you need to calculate this in relation to sales, gross profit, net profit, operating profit. Okay, then operating ratio, then an expenses ratio. In relation to investment, you have to calculate return on investment, return on equity, return on capital, and return earning per share, and return on equity, and price earning ratio. There are various ratios you need to calculate. So you should write these all the things in your notebooks so that you can have a better clarity about this ratio, and one by one we have to go for clearing or having we will solve certain problems, we will do certain numerics, and also we can solve that numeric, and also we have to interpret the result so that you will have a better clarity about this particular subject. So just do write this particular classification of ratio. There are different classification of ratios are there, but you have to focus only the functional classification of ratios, which is very important. Just check it, just write it in your notebook. Okay, hope you have written. Okay, if you are not written, then make the pause of the video, then you can write also, no problem. Now we are going to study the short term liquidity. Okay, now we are going to study the short term liquidity or analysis of short term financial position, analysis of short term financial position, analysis of short term financial position, or test of liquidity. So we have to go with the analysis of short term financial position. So short term financial position sound here nahi. So what is short term financial position? Look at everybody, there are two asset will be there. One is current asset, another is current liability. Your current asset should be more than to the current liability. There are current asset means what? the asset which can be converted into a cash within a period of 1 year. Normally within a period of 1 year, those things which can be converted into cash is known as current asset. There are different components of current asset will be there. There are different components. Sundry debtors will come, bills receivable will come, cash and bank balance will come. Okay, cash in hand, cash at bank, cash at bank. Then prepaid expenses will come, prepaid expenses will come. Then inventories will come. What do you understand by inventory? Inventories means what? Raw material, work in progress and finished goods. These three things will come under what? Inventory. And inventory is also coming under what, everybody? Current asset. Current asset का मतलब क्या है? Those asset which can be converted into cash within a period of 1 year is known as current asset, जो कि आपका शॉर्ट टर्म एसेट है. ओके, जो कि 1 ईयर के बीच क्या होगा? केस में कन्वर्ट हो सकता है. उसे क्या बोलेंगे? करंट एसेट और शॉर्ट टर्म एसेट बोलेंगे. देन व्हाट इज करंट लायबिलिटी? द डिफरेंट आइटम्स विल बी देयर अंडर करंट लायबिलिटी. द सन्ड्री क्रेडिटर्स विल बी देयर. ओके, आउटस्टैंडिंग एक्सपेंसेस विल बी देयर. देन बिल्स पेबल विल बी देयर. देन बैंक ओवरड्राफ्ट विल बी देयर. Usually we are taking the bank overdraft for the short term. Okay, then income tax payable, then dividend payable. So these are all coming under what, everybody? Current liability. So what is this? So again another thing which will come, short term advances. So short term advances is also coming under the current liability. Okay, so short term advance. Similarly, short term investment is coming under current asset. So these are the things which are coming under the current asset, and these are the things which is coming under the current liability. In order to check the short term financial position, in order to analyze the short term financial position, in order to test the liquidity position, what do you understand by liquidity? Liquidity means the firm in a position to pay whatever the due as and when due. The firm is in a position to pay the due whenever there is a demand of the money. You should have sufficient current asset that should able to pay your current obligation. You should have the sufficient current asset to pay the current liability. Okay, you should be in a position, whatever the case is there, whatever the current asset will be there, whatever the liquid asset will be there, that must be sufficient enough to pay your short term obligation. So short term asset, that is current asset, should be sufficient enough to current liability. So in order to test or in order to analyze the short term financial position, we have to see whether in our organization the short term asset or current asset is sufficient or not. If current asset is more than to current liability, then you can able to pay the current liability. Suppose current asset is 1 lakh in total, current liability is 50,000, means out of this 1 lakh you can easily pay how much? 50,000. Okay, so current asset must be sufficient enough to pay what? The current liability. Suppose if this could be the reverse, if the current asset is 50,000 whereas current liability is 1 lakh, means this 50,000 will not recover the particular 1 lakh current liability. At that time we can say that the short term solvency position or liquidity position of the organization is not good. If current asset is more than the current liability, that means the liquidity position of the organization or short term solvency position of the organization or short term financial position of the organization is satisfactory. If current asset is below to the current liability, then the short term position, financial position is not satisfactory. So as and when due, if you are in a position to meet your short term obligation, then we can say your liquidity position is quite sound. If you are not in a position to meet the short term obligation from your short term asset, that means your reputation will come down in the market. The creditor who are there, the banker who are there, they will not come forward to give you the loan. The supplier will not provide you the particular credit to you. So that is a problem for you. If the current asset is more than to your current liability, that means if your short term asset or is more than the short term obligation, that means your liquidity position is sound at that time. At that time your goodwill will increase. At that time getting credit will become very much easier for your business. The reputation will also enhance, and that shows that company's position is, the short term financial position is satisfactory. So under what case the short term position of the company is satisfactory? When your current asset is more than to your current liability. The current asset must be sufficient enough to pay the short term obligation. Current liability means it is the short term obligations, and current asset means it is the short term asset. Your short term asset must be sufficient enough to pay the short term obligation as and when that is due. That is known as what? Liquidity position. Which position? Short term liquidity position. As and when there is anything requirement for the company to pay your short term obligation as and when due from the short term asset, from the current asset, if you are in a position to pay the current liability or short term liability or short term obligations, you can discharge. At that time we can say the financial position of the company is satisfactory. At that time the current asset is more than the current liability. For a organization is said to be satisfactory liquidity when its current asset is more than the current liability. Okay. So there are different kind of ratios should be calculated to check the short term solvency. To check the short term solvency or to test the liquidity, there are different kind of ratios will be calculated. One is liquidity ratio, another one is what? Efficiency ratio. Okay, these two ratios has to be calculated. One is liquidity ratio, another one is efficiency ratio. These two ratios has to be calculated to check the short term financial position of the organization. To check the liquidity position of the organization, you need to calculate these two ratio. One is liquidity ratio, another one is efficiency ratio. So first of all we have to go for liquidity ratio. Okay, to test the short term solvency we need to calculate liquidity ratio. Under functional classification ratios also we discuss about, while discussing about the functional classification ratio, the first ratio which is coming, that is liquidity ratio. Okay, liquidity ratio. Okay, so liquidity means what? You are in a position to pay the due as and when it is due. You are able to pay the due as and when it is due. You are in a position to pay your short term obligations. You can discharge your short term obligation from your short term asset. At that time we can say that the liquidity position of the company is quite sound, quite good. Okay, so liquidity ratio, there are different kind of liquidity ratio will be there. Okay, and liquidity ratios can be measured. Liquidity ratio you have to measure under different ratios. Okay, like current ratio, the liquidity ratio can be measured or can be calculated. Current ratio, then acid test ratio, then absolute liquid ratio. Okay, sometime there is another ratio is the interval ratio. Okay, it is not that much of important. Interval ratio. Okay, when I drawn that particular table or chart, I discuss about the first ratio under the functional classification ratio is liquidity ratio. Under liquidity ratio, what are the ratios are coming? Current ratio, acid test ratio and absolute liquid ratio. Okay, these three ratios which are calculated for what? To measure the liquidity position of the organization. क्या कंपनी के पास उतना sufficient cash और liquid asset है क्या? कंपनी का जो शॉर्ट टर्म ऑब्लिगेशन को पूरा करने के लिए, ये पहचानने के लिए, ये जानने के लिए, ये एनालाइज करने के लिए तुम्हें क्या करना पड़ेगा? लिक्विडिटी रेशियो कैलकुलेट करना पड़ेगा. लिक्विडिटी रेशियो क्या है? करंट रेशियो इज ए लिक्विड रेशियो and liquidity ratio, acid test ratio is a liquidity ratio, absolute liquid ratio is a liquidity ratio, and also this interval ratio is also a liquidity ratio. To measure the liquidity, you can have the calculation of this particular liquidity ratios. Okay, Today we will very much focus on what? Current ratio. Okay, so what is current ratio? Current ratio is nothing but it is the relationship. Current ratio, that is CR, is nothing but it is the relationship between what and what? The current asset to current liability. Current ratio का मतलब क्या है? It is the relation or it is known as working capital ratio also. So current asset to current liability में जो relation है वो उसे क्या बोलते हैं? Current ratio बोलते हैं. Okay, and current ratio, the rule of thumb says that, and the rule of thumb what it says, your current ratio should be 2:1. इसका मतलब क्या है? इसका मतलब है your current asset should be 2 times and current liability should be 1 times. इसका मतलब क्या है? So what is current ratio? Current ratio is current asset by current liability. Current asset divided by current liability is known as current ratio. Look at, suppose current ratio we have to calculate. Let's take current asset कितना दिया है? 1 लाख दिया है, and current liability कितना दिया है? 50,000 दिया है. So how to calculate the current ratio? Current asset divided by current liability. So 1 lakh divided by 50,000. So कितना आया everybody? So 2:1. That means 2:1 होने से वो क्या है? Satisfactory ratio है. 2:1 होने से कंपनी का जो रूल ऑफ थंब के अनुसार वो क्या है? Satisfied है. Current ratio shows that the short term liquidity position of the organization is quite good as it is 2:1. अगर ये रेशियो आया, कितना आया? देखो ये 2 लाख है, 50,000 है. Suppose 2 lakh is the current asset and current liability is 50,000, then the ratio is coming how much? 4:1. यहाँ पे क्या है? रूल ऑफ थंब कितना बताता है? रूल ऑफ थंब बताता है कि योर करंट रेशियो शुड बी 2:1. मतलब करंट एसेट 2 गुना होना चाहिए और करंट लायबिलिटी 1 गुना होना चाहिए. सो यहाँ पे कितना आया? 4:1 आया. क्या ये अच्छा है या बुरा है? समटाइम इट टेल्स दैट if your current ratio is rising or it is above to the rule of thumb, that shows that current asset is more than to your current liability. That shows that the liquidity position is improving. At that time हम क्या बोल सकते हैं कि current ratio अगर rule of thumb से ज़्यादा आया तो हम क्या बोल सकते हैं? The liquidity position is improving. Okay, and the satisfied result is what? If it is 2:1, then there is a satisfied result. If it is below, suppose current liability is something 2 lakh and current asset is something 50,000. So 50,000 by 2 lakh. So what is the result? It is 1/4. It is coming. So it is below 2. It is rule of thumb क्या बताता है? 2:1 बताता है. क्यों ये क्या आया? 1:4. So your current ratio is quite low to the rule of thumb. That means the liquidity position is not improving. The liquidity position is coming down. The liquidity position of the firm is in danger. The liquidity position is decreasing. It is deteriorating. So we can say the liquidity position is not good. So current ratio का मतलब क्या है? The ratio in between the current asset and current liability. ये current asset का क्या है? Current assets are those assets which can be converted into cash within a period of 1 year. Current asset में क्या क्या आया? Last time I discussed current asset का component क्या है? करंट एसेट का कंपोनेंट क्या है? कैश इन हैंड है, कैश एंड बैंक बैलेंस है. ओके, सन्ड्री डेटर्स है, बिल्स रिसीवेबल है, प्रीपेड एक्सपेंसेस है. ओके, देन शॉर्ट टर्म इन्वेस्टमेंट है एंड इन्वेंट्रीज है जिसमें रॉ मटेरियल आएगा, वर्क इन प्रोग्रेस आएगा, फिनिश गुड्स आएगा. ये सारे चीज़ क्या है? करंट एसेट में आता है. योर करंट एसेट शुड बी मोर देन टू योर करंट लायबिलिटी. योर करंट एसेट शुड बी सफिशिएंट इनफ टू पे योर शॉर्ट टर्म ऑब्लिगेशन, जो कि करंट लिक्विडिटी पोजीशन उस दौरान हमें क्या बोलेंगे? सेटिस्फाइड बोल के बोलेंगे. इफ द करंट रेशियो इज increasing, that means the liquidity position is also improving for the particular company. Okay, what is current liability? Current liability is nothing but is the short term obligation of the company. Okay, it may be sundry creditors, it may be bills payable, it may be income tax payable, it may be dividend payable, it may be bank overdraft, it may be outstanding expenses. These are all what? Current liability. Okay, so your current एसेट शुड बी सफिशिएंट इनफ टू करंट लायबिलिटी. आपका करंट एसेट का मात्रा क्या होना चाहिए? ज़्यादा होना चाहिए. किसके मुकाबले? करंट लायबिलिटी के मुकाबले. ताकि हम क्या बोल सकें, द लिक्विडिटी पोजीशन ऑफ द कंपनी इज क्वाइट गुड. Whenever any kind of due arises for the company is in a position to pay the due without any delay. We can say at that time the liquidity position of the organization is quite good, quite fine. So this is all about the idea about the current ratio. Current ratio is nothing but the relationship between the current asset and current liability. It is the ratio of current asset and current liability where the numerator should be the double to the denominator. Okay, आपका जो current asset जो ऊपर रहता है, current liability नीचे रहता है, जो current asset should be more than to your current liability. That means rule of thumb कितना बताता है, जो current liability अगर एक गुना हुआ तो करंट लायबिलिटी एक गुना हो तो करंट एसेट दो गुना होगा. करंट एसेट अगर करंट लायबिलिटी अगर 5 हुआ तो करंट एसेट कितना होगा, 10 होगा. करंट लायबिलिटी 100 हुआ तो करंट एसेट कितना होगा, 200 होगा. ताकि हमें जो रूल ऑफ थंब बताता है वो क्या है, सेटिस्फाइड रिजल्ट बताता है. द लिक्विडिटी पोजीशन इज सेड टू बी गुड. द रूल ऑफ थंब सेज दैट करंट एसेट द करंट रेशियो शुड बी 2:1. ओके, then we have to go for solving a particular problem so that you can have a better clarity about this. Hi everybody, we have to solve a particular problem related to the current ratio. Current ratio is the first ratio which is coming under the liquidity ratio, and current ratio has to be calculated by the formula what, current asset divided by current liability. What? Current ratio has to be calculated with the formula current asset divided by current liability. From this question, look at inventories is there, trade payable will be there, under trade payable sundry creditor will be there, bills payable is there. Okay, 20,000 and bills payable is 15,000. Case and case equivalent 20,000. Other current asset 10,000. Land and building goodwill is there. Then trade receivable sundry debtors is there. Then bills receivable is there. Then outstanding expenses, bank overdraft, debentures and short-term provision. Look at everybody, out of these particular items present in this particular question, which are the items should I take as current asset and which are the item I should take as current liability? Which is not a current liability, we should not take that one. Which is a long-term liability, we should not take as a current liability. Which is a long-term asset also, we should not take as current asset. So we have to be careful while discussing about the current asset. So what can be the current asset? Can inventory will be the current asset? Yes, inventory can be converted into a cash within a period of 1 year. So inventory should be the current asset. Also I discussed in the last class. Then can cash and cash equivalent will be the current asset? Yes. That is 20,000 given in the question. I have to add. Is there a other current asset? As it is given other current asset, so it is a current asset. I need to add that one. Okay. So land and building, that is not a current asset. That is a fixed asset. Goodwill is not also a current asset. Then here sundry debtors is there. Bills payable is there. Sundry debtors is there. Bills receivable is there. Okay. Bills receivable and sundry debtors both are coming under as a current asset. Okay, so we have to add all those items. Okay, so there are around 5 items which are there under this current asset. We have to add all those items and we are getting a total of 1,90,000. We are getting a total of how much? 1,90,000. Okay, similarly, what are the current liabilities there? We have to add now. So sundry creditor is a short-term obligation, that is a current liability. Bills payable is also a current liability, that is given as how much? 15,000. Then outstanding expenses is also a current liability, we have to add. Then bank overdraft, that is 25,000. We have to add, that is a current liability. This debenture is a long term liability, whereas short term provision is a current liability. So that is how much? 18,000. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So how many items are coming under this? Also the 5 items. So 85,000. So if you add, keep on adding all this current liability, then you will get how much? 85,000. The current asset is how much? The current asset is around 1,90,000 and current liability is how much? 85,000. So we have to calculate the current ratio. How you can calculate the current ratio? Current asset divided by current liability. So current asset, the total is how much? 1,90,000, and the current liability, how much the total? 85,000. If you make this ratio, if you can calculate the ratio, then you will get how much? 2.24. You simply use the calculator, you will get the figure of current ratio is 2.24. What do you understand by current ratio? 2.24. 2.24 means it is 2.24:1. So as the rule of thumb says, for the current ratio, your current ratio should be more than 2:1. 2:1, it is a satisfactory ratio. Look at here, it is coming, current asset is coming 2.24, whereas current liability is coming 1. So as the rule of thumb says 2:1, it is more than that, then we can say that liquidity position is quite good for the company. The current ratio is quite satisfactory. If it could have been below the 2.2:1, then we could have been talked that the company's position or liquidity position, short term liquidity position, is not good or not satisfactory. As it is 2.24, मतलब ये क्या है? 2.24, 2 से ज़्यादा है, ये क्या है? सेटिस्फाइड है, और 2:1 से ये ज़्यादा है, तो हम क्या बोलेंगे? द लिक्विडिटी पोजिशन, शॉर्ट टर्म लिक्विडिटी पोजिशन ऑफ द कंपनी इज क्वाइट सेटिस्फैक्टरी इन दिस रिगार्ड. So this is a particular problem what I cited in while discussing about this current ratio. So current ratio में आपका जो इंटरप्रेट करना है, so इस प्रॉब्लम में कंपनी का लिक्विडिटी पोजीशन अच्छा है या बुरा है? कंपनी का लिक्विडिटी पोजीशन अच्छा है. क्यों अच्छा है? क्योंकि जो रूल ऑफ थंब बताता है द करंट रेशियो शुड बी 2:1. यहाँ पे जो करंट रेशियो हमने कैलकुलेट किया, इट इज़ मोर देन दैट, सो दैट्स वाई we can tell that the liquidity position or the short term liquidity position of the company is good. So in this way we can interpret the particular result of the current ratio. So calculation of this particular ratio is very much important, and also interpreting the result is very much important. Today what we discuss is all about, we discuss about to check the short term solvency of the particular short term solvency or short term financial position of the organization. You need to calculate different kind of ratios. There are different kind of ratios has to be calculated to check the short term liquidity position. Liquidity means what? आपके पास इनफ केस होना चाहिए आपका शॉर्ट टर्म ऑब्लिगेशन को मीट अप करने के लिए विदाउट एनी डिले. जब कभी भी शॉर्ट टर्म ऑब्लिगेशन आता है, आप कभी भी डिले ना करके उस शॉर्ट टर्म ऑब्लिगेशन को पूरा करते हैं. कहाँ से? आपके शॉर्ट टर्म एसेट से, करंट एसेट से. उसका मतलब क्या है? आपका लिक्विडिटी पोजीशन, आपका शॉर्ट टर्म फाइनेंशियल पोजीशन क्या है? आपका शॉर्ट टर्म फाइनेंशियल पोजीशन अच्छा है. Okay, so you need to check the liquidity, you need to measure the liquidity. There are different kind of ratios should be calculated. Out of that, the current ratio is very much important. Under the current ratio, the two important things which are coming, two important components are coming. One is current asset and another one is current liability. Current assets are those which can be converted into cash within a period of 1 year. जो कि 1 year period में जो कि केस में कन्वर्ट हो सकता है, उसे क्या बोलेंगे? करंट एसेट बोलेंगे. सो अंडर करंट एसेट we discuss short term investment, prepaid expenses, sundry debtors, bills receivable, inventories, cash and bank balance. These are all coming under what? Current asset. Under current liability, what are the things coming? Or under current liability, what are the things coming? Bills payable, sundry creditors, okay, then some bank overdraft. These are all coming under what? Current liability. Your current assets should be more than your current liability. At that time we can tell that the liquidity position or the financial position of the company is quite good. The rule of thumb says that your current ratio should be 2:1. Okay, that means your short term assets should be 2 times to your short term obligation. The current liability means short term obligation. Current asset means the short term asset. Your short term asset should be 2 times than your short term obligation. At that time we can tell that your company's position, your company's short term liquidity position is satisfactory. अगर करंट रेशियो अगर इंक्रीज हो रहा है एक कंपनी का, तो हम क्या इंटरप्रेट करेंगे, द कंपनीज लिक्विडिटी पोजीशन इज इम्प्रूविंग, द कंपनीज लिक्विडिटी पोजीशन इज इंक्रीजिंग, दैट इज हैविंग ए satisfactory result. Similarly, if the current ratio is decreasing, then we can say that the liquidity position is decreasing at that particular point of time. Always remember, a high current ratio, that does not means that the liquidity position of the company is very good. Always remember, एक हद पास होके, एक लिमिट क्रॉस होने के बाद करंट रेशियो अगर हाई होगा तो हम बोल नहीं सकते, हम इंटरप्रेट नहीं कर सकते हैं कि एक कंपनी का लिक्विडिटी पोजीशन अच्छा है बोल के। क्यों? क्योंकि करंट रेशियो हाई फिगर कब शो करेगा, जब आपका डेटर इंक्रीज होगा, जब आपका इन्वेंट्री भी इंक्रीज होगा, जब आपका सेल्स अगर नहीं होगा, सिर्फ और सिर्फ फिनिश गुड्स इंक्रीज होगा, तो उस दौरान आपका क्या होगा, करंट रेशियो भी हाई पोजीशन शो करेगा। क्योंकि आपके पास क्या है, आपके पास अगर आइडियल केस भी रहेगा, आपके पास अनयूज्ड केस भी रहेगा जो कि बैंक में है, जो कि यूज़ नहीं हो रहा है, तब भी आपका हाई करंट रेशियो भी क्या हो शो करेगा, जो कि अच्छा नहीं है एक कंपनी के लिए। इफ़ the debtors are rising, if the inventories are rising, if there is a ideal case is there in the particular bank of a particular company, at that time, even though the current ratio is showing the high figure more than the rule of thumb, more than the particular rule of thumb, that is 2:1 से ज़्यादा शो कर रहा है, तो ये हम इंटरप्रेट नहीं कर सकते हैं, ये हम कंक्लूजन में कभी नहीं बोल सकते कि लिक्विडिटी पोजीशन ऑफ द कंपनी इज इंक्रीजिंग और इट लिक्विडिटी पोजीशन इज क्वाइट वेरी मच गुड. सो इट डिपेंड्स. सो एंड बट the rule of thumb says that the current ratio should be 2:1. That means the current asset should be the 2 times than the current liability. Suppose the current asset is, suppose the current liability is, okay, let's take 3 lakh. So current asset should be how much? 6 lakh. So that the ratio will be how much? 2:1. Okay. So while interpreting the result, you have to see whether that is the current ratio, what are the current ratio you are getting after calculating, whether it is more than the current ratio or not, more than the rule of thumb or not. The rule of thumb is how much? 2:1. 2:1 को हम क्या बोलते हैं? रूल ऑफ थंब बोलते हैं करंट रेशियो का, जो कि करंट एसेट डबल होना चाहिए करंट एसेट के मुकाबले. उस दौरान हम क्या बोल सकते हैं? द कंपनीज लिक्विडिटी पोजीशन of the company, the short term liquidity position of the company is very good, because the firm is in a position to pay the short term obligation, that is current liability, from the current asset. At that time, the reputation of the company, the goodwill of the company, whatever the sundry creditor will be there, banker will be there, financial institution will be there, they will have a confidence about the particular company, its goodwill will enhance at that point of time, and the company will be in a position to produce whatever the goods he want or it want, as and when that is required without any interruption. It is in a position to do the production. So today we discussed about this liquidity ratio. Under the liquidity ratio we discussed about the current ratio. Thank you for listening patiently.